today she will talk about eco-justice for harm from international development. So very, very welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for being here.
That's wonderful. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Christina, and lovely to see you, Gustav, and so many familiar faces and new faces as well. I have to admit I have a great deal of envy for all of the early career researchers that have these dialogues. It's such a wonderful opportunity that I wish I had when I was starting out. So what I'm going to talk about today is eco-justice in international development. And I'd really encourage you to put any questions you have in the chat or wave your hand or jump in. So this is a real seminar style and very open to interrupting. I'm probably going to talk about 30 minutes and then open it up to broader discussion. But if you do have a particular thing that you would like to talk about throughout as I'm speaking, feel free to do so. So why am I interested in eco-justice in international development? This really was the focus of a short Cambridge Elements book that I did for the ESG series that came out last year called Environmental Recourse at the Multilateral Development Banks. And I've been interested in this proliferation of what have become known as international grievance mechanisms. And the multilateral development banks have what I call a subclass of these grievance mechanisms. And really what they attempt to do is to provide recourse for people that have been adversely affected by an international development project that has been financed by the multilateral development banks. So the most well-known is of course, the World Bank. So this is a type of grievance mechanism, and I examine them in the Cambridge Elements book for ESG for 3 reasons. The first is that they have amassed considerable experience over 2 decades in responding to environmental and social claims from people that have been harmed by international development projects. So we've got a real wealth of data that we can use to try and identify how it is that international actors have responded to claims of environmental and social harm. The second reason why I looked at them is because they're public funders. And so these to me are the most likely cases for the grievance mechanisms to actually operate compared with a much less transparent private sector or lesser known or public resourced funders. And so the types of development organizations I'm talking about, the World Bank, all of the regional development banks, the Asian, the African, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So we get a good sense of if and how they are able to respond to claims of harm that have directly resulted from international development projects. So this is really a key concern of mine and part of the Accountability in Global Environmental Governance Task Force with Teresa Crummarts, where we try and pass out how useful accountability mechanisms are at the global level and whether or not they provide any payoffs for the people that try to use them. So what grievance, what rights? Quite simply, these are non-legal, non-binding mechanisms. And what's interesting is, as I said, there's been a proliferation of these international grievance mechanisms that are now being used to provide recourse for people suffering environmental and social harm, principally from internationally funded development projects. But to date, there have been almost no studies that show whether or not these mechanisms actually make a difference to people using them. And this is the Namada Dam campaign, a massive protest movement in India, really kick-started the discussion about whether or not international development funders should be held to account for their environmental and social impacts. The Namada Dam, it was really a collection of 30,000 big, small, medium dams across 3 states in India, largest civil protest in the nation's history, and sparked a massive campaign against the World Bank that created the World Bank Inspection Panel in 1994. This then cascaded towards all the other multilateral and also bilateral development lenders, that everyone should have this sort of grievance mechanism to provide recourse for people. So this was a major event, both in India and of course globally, in terms of creating these mechanisms. But as I said, they're non-binding and they are non-legal. And essentially what they seek to do is provide recourse, so to allow people to air their grievances, and the accountability mechanisms then investigate these claims as to whether or not they're bona fide, and then present that evidence to the banks, and principally to the bank's shareholders, which are member states, as to whether or not the Multilateral Development Bank has or has not complied with its environmental and social policies. So the environmental and social policies cover everything from environmental impact assessment as the umbrella policy, biodiversity or wildlife, the use of chemicals, forestry. There are policies that cover how they impact on Indigenous people, and whether or not, as in the case of the Namada Dam, whether or not it involved involuntarily resettling people in order to make way for the development project. So what my research has done is to look at the impact of these grievance mechanisms or providing redress for these grievances. And this sort of to give you a bit of an idea, I mean, the World Bank lends approximately 60 billion, or the World Bank Group, the World Bank itself lends 20 billion annually to developing countries to fund energy, telecommunications and infrastructure projects that address poverty and improve people's lives. But we know for a fact that development projects can have dramatic and irreversible environmental and social impacts, loss of lives, livelihoods and land, breakdown in community cohesion, species extinction, habitat loss and irreparable damage to local ecosystems. Despite the World Bank's mechanism, the inspection panel operating for over 25 years, we still do not know how it, or indeed any other international grievance mechanism, actually contributes to improving conditions in project areas. And I've got a picture here of a group of what they call accountability officers that are going out into the field to actually investigate a claim by a community that they have been harmed as a result of the project funded by a multilateral development bank. From memory, I think this is the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman for the World Bank Group. So people harmed by international development projects, of course, don't have to go to these mechanisms. These are entirely voluntary and they're what's called citizen-driven. You have to make the complaint yourself. The onus is on the community to complain. But of course, we know that there are reasons why communities might not choose to complain to their own government or to a corporation or executing agency that is undertaking the development project itself. And this is because they fear state and corporate reprisal for speaking out for protecting their community and their environment. And in 2019, 4 environmental defenders were being killed every week around the world for doing precisely that, for speaking out. And that's a 30% increase from 2018 figures. And so one of the reasons why I've given you the readings that you have for this topic is to precisely pass out how conflict at the local level is very much bound into these processes of hyperglobalization, production and consumption that we are witnessing globally. So what's happening at the local level has deep connections to what's happening at the global level. In addition to which, of course, we know that these impacts are local, but they are, of course, also global. International development practices are contributing to the known crossing of ecological system boundaries globally, climate change being the most obvious, but the impacts on habitat loss and species extinction, deforestation are all interrelated, the outcome of which is likely to surpass known experience, which will alter almost all human and natural systems. And that's a direct quote from a 2019 report by the United Nations looking at disaster recovery. So we know that there are legal mechanisms that people can choose either through the state or through regional or international processes. Legal arbitration courts and tribunals are proliferating in number, but we're also seeing the attendant rise of these non-binding, non-legal mechanisms, these international grievance mechanisms. And I just want to highlight that while I look at a very specific class of grievance mechanisms, these accountability mechanisms of the multilateral development banks, there is just this broader proliferation of this idea that you can address people's problems in developing countries that arise from transnational or international interaction through a grievance mechanism. And I've listed a sort of various different types of grievance mechanisms that have proliferated. So we've got stakeholder initiatives like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. We've got industry-based ones to reconcile people's needs in developing countries versus consumers, such as the Fair Trade Association, the multilateral development banks, which I study, but also specific corporate level ones run by transnational corporations like Hewlett-Packard or Apple. And this gives rise to a whole different range of accountability mechanisms and procedures that exist. And so they're all slightly different in how they seek to operate, but they're also kind of the same. And they're kind of the same in terms of the fact that they were created by transnational or by international actors to give affected or potentially affected people the right to seek recourse for impacts on their activities, especially where they have no access to a liability mechanism. So these grievance mechanisms try to provide direct recourse for people and their environments if they have been affected by these transnational or international actors. So I've been particularly concerned with how these non-judicial processes to work to ameliorate environmental and social harm. And again, as I said, these claims have to be instigated by people on behalf of their communities and ecosystems. So this is really, again, important in the sense that these grievance mechanisms can identify, that we can identify how they play a role when people don't trigger a legal process. And so this is a sort of right to recourse in the sense that they're trying to provide access to justice. And this is in many ways a sort of seen as a softer way, certainly by the corporations and the banks, a softer way of dealing with people's grievances rather than going through legal or political channels. So they're triggered by complaints by people. This sets them apart from sort of other automatic triggers that perhaps might exist. And you can see the sort of difference in the types of structures that are on the screen, particularly the multi-stakeholder, the industry ones. Well, actually, no, they're all sort of top down in terms of their structure. They were created by the perpetrators, if you will, for people to complain to. And I think there's a very, very real problem there in terms of power structures. And we can talk about that in the Q&A or in the discussion component of this hour. But it is something to think about. And certainly the work that Kate McDonald's done and Lena Parch, both members of ESG, have been to identify, well, whose interests are being served by these corporate style mechanisms or by these industry mechanisms or by the multi-stakeholder mechanisms. And the United Nations Office for Human Rights is now increasingly interested in whether or not these accountability mechanisms are actually, or grievance mechanisms are actually doing what they are purportedly designed to do. And a 2018 review by the Office of Human Rights basically identified that there was a dearth of publicly available information on whether or not international grievances established by corporations were actually able to do what they said that they would do. And essentially there was limited and primarily case study research conducted predominantly by NGOs. And so this is in, sort of piecemeal in the sense that we could try and identify the limits of what these grievance mechanisms could do. And the report pointed to a glaring lacunae on the procedural and substantive practices of corporations in using grievance mechanisms, either alone as part of these multi-stakeholder processes. But what they did identify was that the corporate grievance mechanisms were very much overly focused on monetary compensation. Oh, we've accidentally polluted your river, here's some money. So this is really inadequate to address the types of human rights and environmental concerns compared with judicial mechanisms. So this sort of raises the question as to, how they operate and what they do. And the sort of work where I sort of ended that Cambridge Elements book leads me into my current research, which is to identify, well, what are we talking about when we talk about eco-justice? And for many, many people around the world, it's a concern for not just people, but people in place. And so the procedural environmental rights are either implicit or explicit in some of these grievance mechanisms, standards or policies that they say that they provide recourse for. And so I identified the procedural environmental rights that are increasingly used, not just in regional conventions like Aarhus in Europe or the Escazú Agreement in Latin America, but also starting to pop up in multilateral environmental agreements. And this principally talks about people's right to access to information about environmental matters, the right to participate in decisions on environmental matters that affect you, and the right to access justice in environmental matters. So these are increasingly seen as important human rights, that people do have the right to know about these things. And of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also highlights free, prior and informed consent. And I think all of these rights are increasingly being identified, particularly by the multilateral development banks as a result of UN pressure to recognise that those rights are actually already in a lot of the environmental and social standards that the banks say that they uphold when they undertake international development. And I'm happy to talk about that at more length, throughout our discussion, but I just want to make it clear, like we can see that in terms of the types of policies that they have, policies on information disclosure, policies on participation, and the creation of these grievance mechanisms in terms of access for justice. But of course, I'm also deeply, deeply interested in what role, if any, nature plays. Are there rights to nature? And of course, this itself is a movement that is sort of growing around the world to recognise that nature itself should have rights, or perhaps in many cultures does already have rights, the rights to exist, the right to repair and the right to regenerate. So local ecosystems should have these rights. And so for me, I've started to think about eco-justice as being not just environmental justice, which captures these procedural environmental rights, but also ecological justice, which is that one step further to actually recognise people exist within a place, and you cannot disassociate people from their places, which is a very Western understanding of nature, that it can be bought and sold and traded, and that what happens above ground is different from what happens below ground or outside your exclusive economic zone, which is, of course, how development is done. And so, indeed, if you look at many of the claims that come before the multilateral development banks, land and land rights are fundamental to it. But, of course, the banks themselves, as multilateral institutions, can't engage in that debate and discussion because they then infringe on the sovereign rights of borrowing countries. And so I've started to think of justice, whether or not justice can be actually met by using these international grievance mechanisms. And I'm hoping you can see this. It's a pretty crude drawing, but it does, I think, give you a bit of an idea of what it is that people are making complaints about. And so what I started to do, both in the last book feeding into this book, is to start to map those concerns about environmental procedural rights with the rights of nature to concerns, you know, the theoretical literature on justice, about recognition, about participation, about people's capabilities and the right to flourish, and nature's and ecosystems' right to flourish, to the complaints that were actually being submitted to these grievance mechanisms by the multilateral development banks. And it's kind of interesting because, as I said, there's a wealth of data that's available on these mechanisms. So the World Bank Inspection Panel was created in 1994. All of the other mechanisms were created in the 1990s to the mid-2000s. Excuse me. So what I did was to collect all of the publicly available submissions that I could. And up to the end of 2019, I think it was, I collected over 1,000 submissions to all of these, the bigger multilateral development banks. And out of those, I was able to identify 394 original submissions from communities. So this is 2 or more people in a project affected area financed by a multilateral development bank complaining about harm, environmental and social harm, or likely harm that was going to come from that project. And so this covers a whole wealth of development projects, everything from railways to roads to power plants to sewerage plants to you know, literally think of any development project and there will be a claim about it. So it covers all of these banks. It covers the whole portfolio of the banks, and it covers a quite extensive amount of claims. What you might notice here is that there's about 37% of original submissions from the big bank of all of the submissions. And basically the reason why is because some of the banks allow for confidential submissions by people that do fear state reprisal or corporate reprisal. So they do not release public information from the claimants as to who they are to the public, which I think is fair enough. But there were so nearly 400 claims made by people that were willing to allow that to be made public. And I collected all of this from the multilateral development bank's grievance mechanisms. Pretty much over a 20-year period, they have become a lot more transparent and a lot more accountable themselves as to how they are identifying or accepting submissions, whether or not they see them as bona fide submissions, you know, as in they're valid, they are about a multilateral development bank project, they are in the project affected area, they do have a legitimate grievance, and then assess them. And so the content analysis that I undertook was really to try and identify what it is that people were complaining about. And so I sort of broke down a connection of the types of complaints that were being made by communities to these nodes of complaints. And so linking, you know, whether or not people, abuse is quite a distinct one that's very much involved in threats to people's lives, and physical harm. But certainly the others are very much based on making that connection between environmental rights and ecological rights through to the justice categories. So very much looking at consent, whether or not people were complaining that they hadn't been asked for consent, that they had not been involved through participation. And so we see that the beginning of recognition where people sort of identified as being a community that might be affected by a development project. whether or not they were invited to participate in how the project was being designed, whether or not they participated in identifying whether or not harm was likely to occur, informed consent, whether or not they were asked to give consent, whether or not they gave consent, and then looking at the range of distribution impacts. You'll see distribution, I'm not sure if you can see it very clearly, but distribution is the big blue bar in the middle, and that's very much about the fact that most people were deeply, deeply concerned about the distribution of risks and the distribution of benefits from those projects. And that's broken down into subcategories. Distribution is really about how they were going to be affected. But then capabilities is also a key component of the justice literature in terms of whether or not an international development project would actually help the capabilities of individuals and communities to flourish. And we therefore then broke it down into sub-nodes. So this was an analysis undertaken of the original submissions of the complaints to the MDB's grievance mechanism through NVivo. And we were able to identify different capabilities that were being adversely affected by these projects. So physical capabilities in terms of what was being taken away from communities, which is very, very different from social capabilities. Social capabilities really refers to the social cohesion of the community, whether or not they felt that they were able to continue to organise their community, whether or not their bonds were being broken as a result of the project creating divisions within that community, and whether or not they were able to organise either based on sort of kinship ties, or whether or not that was based on being able to organise, say, through trade unions, which is different again from religious and cultural capabilities. Because we know for a fact that different development projects can often take place in culturally sacred areas. So we found quite, again, this is across all of the banks, and I do have data that breaks down the different banks, but this looks across all of them. And so, you know, distribution is key in terms of how people felt that they were being impacted as a community, but also as individuals. Anyone, you know, as long as there's 2 or more people in the project affected area can make a complaint. So clearly feeling that the community and individuals within those communities were being adversely impacted. So what we did in terms of identifying the complaints was that, you know, we didn't say that any one specific complaint only made a complaint about distribution, about how they were being adversely affected. We counted all of the complaints. So many of them have multiple complaints, that they were concerned about their economic capacity in terms of how they were going to find work if they were being moved as a result of the project, as well as being concerned about the impact on biodiversity, for example. So many of the complaints had more than one concern, and these are captured in this, at least how we've done it here, captured in terms of the overall concerns of communities. So what does this indicate? Well, we can say that yes, they do provide access to justice in environmental matters, and they do capture the breadth of eco-justice, that people are concerned about their impacts on their ability, that the development projects hadn't enabled them to be recognised and therefore to participate, that they hadn't been provided with information disclosure, that they hadn't been able, that they were mainly concerned about the impacts of the project on their abilities to work and to function, but it covered a whole band of areas. And we can also identify, and this is the concern and one of the reasons why I incorporated this idea of ecological justice and the rights of nature, is that people and these are mechanisms for people, were also separately concerned about their environment, irrespective of their own needs. And, 49% of those claimants were complaining about lack of access to information, and just under that amount for participation. But 27% of claimants were concerned about their ecosystem independent of their own needs. So I think that's quite a lot of material to give you. I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Susan. Great and very interesting talk. I really encourage all participants to put either questions in chat or raise your hand using the little hand tool if you want, as we now kind of enter more of a conversation. It would be lovely if you could also enable your cameras, if you so please, just so we can feel like it's more of a dialogue than a one-way conversation. So I think Sebi Bliss, you have already posted the first question, so I think we will start with this, and I'll read it out to you, Susan. So she asks, do MDBs have an element of reflexivity / learning, i.e. ties in with the ESG research lens, i.e. if a grievance is common to, do they have process to address the grievances to prevent these in the future?
It's a really great question. On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. The short answer. The longer answer is that everybody knows that the projects that end up in these grievance mechanisms are red flag projects. They are projects that have had problems from the get-go. And the multilateral development banks, on the one hand, say, well, yeah, it's less than 1% of our portfolio of projects that end up looking like this. We're talking about grievances that can go on for over a decade and are not resolved. The project still goes ahead while people are making a complaint. So, they're being moved as the complaint is going through. So there is a very real problem with the fact that it doesn't stop the project from going through. And that's how the banks want it. And developing countries as well. Are they learning? In some ways, no. So the red flags are always around Indigenous peoples. They're always around involuntary resettlement. They're the two big ones. Lack of information, lack of participation are endemic for these types of projects. And they're aware of that, but they don't seem to be changing. On the other hand, so there is a real disconnect, which is sort of end of a book that I've been working on. To my mind, these grievance mechanisms were not designed to lead to learning within the banks. They were actually designed as a corrective. A problem happens, we correct it. It doesn't lead to better learning within the banks and within international development, which is, I think, deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. But the grievance mechanisms themselves are getting better, which is kind of interesting. So over a 20-year period is that they get reviewed every 3 to 5 years, and all of the mechanisms look to each of the last bank's reviews to see how they can be improved. They've become much more transparent, much more transparent. They've become more responsive to project-affected people. So project-affected people can now be part of the process. It used to be that they would just submit the complaint and that was it, their job was done. They would then be interviewed to see whether or not their claim was bona fide. So they're a lot more involved now. The other thing that's happened is that bank management continuously continue to say that things are fine, there's no problem to see here. And so member states have woken up to this, and they've started to give the grievance mechanisms more power to monitor when harm has been identified. The banks have been found to have not followed their own environmental and social policies. So that the member states have said, well, you need to fix this. And then they give the monitoring of the fixing to the grievance mechanism. So that's giving them much more power than they ever had before. So it's kind of interesting. To my mind, this could ultimately lead to some better learning if they have that monitoring power to consistently say, you said you would fix this, you haven't fixed this. This community is still waiting. What are you doing? Why haven't you done it?
Okay, thank you, Susan. And Sabi, do you want to ask any follow-up questions to that? Or?
No, thank you. That was a really comprehensive answer. Thanks, Susan.
Very nice. So I'm not going to read out the next question. Instead, I think we have a question from Shahana. And I'm going to ask you to read it out yourself. I think that's a bit nicer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Susan. It was very interesting. I was wondering, don't these MDBs have an environmental impact assessment prior to decision making to lend the money or not? Because I worked with ADB quite for a while, and I know sometimes they leave it to the country, a member state, to run this environmental impact assessment, and most of the time it's not very accurate and they might hide some facts, but I was wondering what are the factors that they accept the project by knowing that it has some impacts on the environment? Thank you.
It's a really great question. Yeah, so the environmental impact assessment has to be done in order for the loan to be released. Of course, I mean, what I've discovered, and maybe you have as well in your experience, is that it turns into this kind of your specialist versus my technical expert. And so some of the biggest projects that have just gone completely wrong in terms of contributing to significant environmental and social harm have been miscategorized. So environmental category A, which is, you know, the big projects that absolutely must have a really rigorous environmental impact assessment because they are known to likely to contribute to harm, versus a category B, which needs less environmental oversight, versus a category C or a financial intermediary loan, which has at the beginning had no oversight at all. And so when the projects get to the stage where communities, and these are last resort mechanisms, right? If you've got a problem with a project, you go to the executing agency, which is the government department of transport or whatever that's undertaking the project. You complain to them, and if you get no recourse, you go to the bank management that's actually undertaking the loan. And if you get no luck there, then you can complain to the grievance mechanism. So as a last resort, it's generally known that these problems have been red flagged in the sense of, oh, well, they should have done that, but maybe they didn't, or they did do it, but maybe it wasn't done very well. And it was sort of pushed through because of the MDBs having this incentive system to keep pumping out loans and to keep lending to developing countries. So they are there, all the procedures are there. And what's interesting is the World Bank has the arguably gold standard environmental and social policies. But it's when they're not being followed consistently that lead to these massive problems. And so again, I talk about the fact that it's less than 1% of the bank's portfolios, but these are often really high profile, big problems, big projects that are affecting, thousands of people.
Okay, thank you very much. Susan, thank you, Shahana, for that very interesting question. I think, Thais, you had your hand up, and I'm not sure, it's down now, so I'm not sure if you had a question that you want to ask.
Actually, I had a crash in Zoom, so my hand raised. I don't know how, but I do have a question. So I'm just going to use this opportunity. I was just thinking about the procedural environmental rights and all the debate here about how there are mechanisms, but the results are not so good. And my question is about how these mechanisms are developed. and how they are put in place for local communities, like how they communicate to these local communities. We have the mechanisms. We have like an exposed procedure. So the project is going on and they are having this negative impact. But do these communities really feel like they are represented by these mechanisms, the concepts, the procedures that are being used? Do they really dialogue with these communities and how they see the project's impact at the local level? Because if then, for example, for traditional communities or for indigenous people, perhaps these mechanisms and these procedures, they don't make a lot of sense of what they perceive as the impacts in the local ground. And I know this is really difficult to assess by a database and by these formal procedures, but how do you see this kind of crash that happens between the procedures and how they are perceived at the local level? Thank you.
You're absolutely right. It's not captured because in the original submissions, which is what I'm looking at to identify whether or not people are asking for eco-justice. But I have spent a lot of time trawling through the documents produced by the mechanisms themselves. So they produce annual reports, and of course they have a lot of information on each and every one of the projects that are complained about. And it's very clear that some mechanisms are not viewed by communities as being in their interests. So the Asian Development Bank, for example, their accountability mechanism, there was one project, which was a wastewater plant in Indonesia, where the community withdrew their complaint because they said, look, you've sent us these Asian Development Bank staffers. We know what they want. They want the project to keep going. They're not interested in what we want, which is to stop the project. So why are we wasting our time? The project's continuing while we wait for some sort of answer from you as to what's going to happen when we know it's not going to go in our favour. So there's some recognition there. And I think one of the reasons why I was really interested in looking at this was, and nobody's done this because the mechanisms don't have the remit to do it, is to look at whether or not people are better off. Like if you have 3 or 4 options, why would you choose this one instead of maybe a mass political campaign or a legal option, or, you know, a transnational, a boomerang campaign with the transnational advocacy campaign? So these are really pertinent questions, but I see some being better than others. The Compliance Advisor Ombudsman for the World Bank Group has consistently focused on people first, and their aim has always been to sit with the community and identify and work with the community how to improve their situation. And they have built in a process whereby they always build in a local mediator, and they have set procedures for when that mediator takes over during the process. So they are quite simply building capacity for communities that are making complaints, so hopefully leaving them better off than they were. So it's not just a single intervention. That's really, really rare though, really rare. But what I see is what should be standard procedure.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, Thais, for that question. I think the next question is Liliana. You've been anticipatory, put on the headphones already. So I will hand it over to you, and then I will hand it over to Rebecca after that. So Liliana, please.
Thanks, Gustav. Thanks, Susan. This is a really interesting talk. Can you hear me, by the way? Yes, okay. You had mentioned that the banks that you surveyed or that you reviewed use monetary methods primarily as a way to like solve issues with the grievance. Can you talk about alternatives to monetary approaches, and maybe if it helps you focus? In particular, I'm interested in grievances about resettlement of communities. I did some work once prior to stumbling onto my current research topic, and it was about there was a very large dam being built in Southeast Asia, and many indigenous communities being affected and having to move. And so you mentioned like the project goes ahead. This one actually had stopped because there were some violent protests, and I think it was because out of the safety of the dam, the construction team. But I'm just curious about how that particular issue has evolved. You said that that the banks have gotten better over time, so maybe you can speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The comment about primarily providing monetary solutions was about the sort of corporate grievance mechanisms and the multi-stakeholder ones. And a lot of those are human rights and industrial disputes. So they just provide compensation. The multilateral development banks don't provide compensation because essentially when something breaks down, it's demonstrating that there has been a failure on behalf of usually the government, the executing agency, to undertake to meet the environmental and social standards. So the banks get in trouble because they haven't overseen the application of the environmental and social standards. But it's up to the executing agency, usually the government, to actually undertake it. The Asian Development Bank does, of course, or I've noticed a specific trend, focus on ensuring repayment. So where this comes into effect is, again, this is resettlement issue, particularly around the Cambodian railway. So that was a massive project where, you know, hundreds of people were moved to make way for the sort of reintroduction of a railway. It had fallen into disuse and they wanted to get it back. But people were living on the actual railway. And so they moved all these people. And the concern there was that people were being moved, some of them involuntarily, some of them voluntarily, to places that had no services. People were given cash payments for squatting, basically, even though they'd been there for a generation at least. And essentially were falling into debt trapped because they were further away from employment. There were no services, there were no dwellings. You know, it sort of snowballed the impacts on the communities that did move versus those that were a little bit further away from the railway and could stay. And what the bank grievance mechanism discovered when people made complaints was that they had recommended a compensation package to the Cambodian government that was well below market rate. And so, and the accountability officer said to me, ADB did a boo-boo. And so communities were, you know, falling into this massive debt trap. They had no jobs. It's just really quite horrendous. So in that sense, compensating people, fixing that compensation problem was a major, major concern. But there are, of course, many, many examples where people aren't looking for compensation. They just want the problem fixed. And so some really, really basic ones are, you know, roadways that cut across people's land, dissecting grazing areas so cows or goats can't actually get to pasture. You know, hadn't actually talked to the graziers, you know, finding ways so the goats could get to pasture. I mean, these are basic things, but it's surprising what gets overlooked because it's not considered important enough. So that those types of things, you know, whether or not 4 olive trees were cut down in order to make way for, you know, really, really, really super basic things. But of course, we know these people, many, many people are below the poverty line. And so that is a huge difference. But for a big bank that's lending out, you know, millions of dollars for a project, you know, this is a minor inconvenience to them. But I think it speaks to a sort of broader problem as to how the international banks, the multilateral banks, development banks are sort of perceiving what are the environmental and social issues that lead to claims down the track.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Lily, for that very interesting question, or questions, rather. So we are 8 minutes from full time, and we do have a few questions still pending. So I will try to, maybe if we can try to get to them before, that would be great. Next up is Rebecca, and then I will let Maria ask her question following that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustav, and thank you, Susan, for your interesting talk. My question relates to what you said on the impact on social cohesion, because first I could imagine that the individualization that the paper you shared puts intergroup social cohesion at risk. But then I can also imagine that when you have within one group that there's not everyone is agreeing with what's negotiated in the end in that whole process. So is there any research on, or could you speak to that a bit more, on how these mechanisms on these different scales within group and between group impact social cohesion at a wider level on the local and maybe regional scale? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, the Cambodia Railway project that the Asian Development Bank and a whole bunch of other funders put in for is a really good example, because there were 4 separate claims made by different people within 3 communities along the railway that submitted claims. And some of those claims were adequately addressed, and those people compensated and much improved lives as a result of that. Those that didn't complain got nothing, obviously, and some that did complain didn't have their issues resolved. So imagine being part of the community that didn't get their issues resolved versus the part of the community that did. And it really did come down to, you know, were you 2 feet away from the railway? You're not part of the area of concern. You're not part of the project. If you are in it and you complained, then we'll deal with it. But if you are in it and you didn't complain, you get nothing. So that creates a whole bunch of new tensions that weren't there before. You can also see the differences with communities in terms of the role that NGOs play. NGOs play an incredibly important role in spreading information about these mechanisms, but they can also become part of the tensions within communities, those that want to listen to NGOs, those that don't. And the NGOs themselves, of course, have their own issues as to whether or not they're in favour of the MDBs or in favour of the grievance mechanisms. And we can see that in different countries where different NGOs have come out in favour and others have not, and communities have been divided as to whether or not to take their advice or not. So social cohesion is incredibly challenged by these mechanisms, even though the mechanisms themselves are for communities.
Okay, thank you. So I think it looks to me as if Wendy and also Maria's questions are a little bit interlinked. So maybe Maria, you can read your question first, and then Wendy, if you don't mind also reading out a little bit from your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Hi, everyone, and hi, Susan. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering if you see any risk that a large number of complaints or applications for this grievance mechanism from stakeholders in a particular place or particular country in any way might discourage the World Bank or project developers to go into that place to develop projects. And as a follow-up then, do you see any risk that there are clashes between national interests, for example, in getting projects and local interests of, you know, sustaining environmental social justice, and that might affect the possibility or the encouragement in that context to actually apply for grievance mechanisms?
Hi, and oh, sorry. I'll tack mine on the end. I guess in the context, thanks very much, Susan. Thinking about governance and institutional reflexivity, my question was around, you know, is there a problem if you're only allowed to complain after a project's underway, and if you're in one of the affected people in the affected area? Because especially the Balaton Crimes and Haynes paper that you shared, I felt like that went well beyond complaints to tweak a project. And it was really saying, what if you have a fundamental problem with how these development MDBs are working? It strikes me that we're talking about including people much earlier in the process in a governance way, rather than complaining after the fact kind of thing.
That's great. I'll answer those three. What impact do these complaints have? Mark Bantain's written a great book that came out in 2016, where he looked at whether or not there was a chilling effect of making complaints to the grievance mechanisms of multilateral development banks. And he actually noticed that there was generally a 5-year gap after a major complaint to one of these accountability mechanisms. So the banks were less likely to provide loans to those countries like Brazil if there had been a major complaint that had become, public, a public travesty. So there was a 5-year lag effect as a result of those. Other scholars are now looking at, but I haven't seen any results yet, as to whether or not there, are certain countries more likely to have complaints. So whether or not authoritarian states already have that chilling effect versus other countries. I haven't seen any of their results, and I'm still not entirely sure how they've, made that delineation on states regime type. But I'm sort of curious as to see whether or not there is some sort of impact. Biggest problem is, of course, most people never heard of these mechanisms, don't even know who's funding the projects in their communities. I mean, sometimes you see signs and other times you don't. And most of the time there's multiple funders as well. On the question of whether or not the complaints, I think the Ballatin piece, I deliberately gave you that to give you that sort of recognition that quite often communities don't want what the funders do. And that is a fundamental mismatch. And yes, we know in development projects, there's, the participation thing's been going on for decades. Communities are meant to be involved. There's meant to be buy-in. But, for a lot of projects, that's just talking to one person or having a sort of town hall where they basically tell you this is what's happening. It's in no way deliberative or involved. And I think, of course, that's one of the biggest problems as to why we see what we see in these terms of people being harmed, is that there's a fundamental mismatch between what the government wants and they organise with an international funder and what communities want. And, I've really struggled with this for a very long time, as no doubt many of you have who've thought about development, as to, when is it in the better interests of society as a whole versus an individual community in the area. At what point can this be made better? And I just, I'm struck again and again and again by the complaints that people put in, that they just, why did they put it there? Why didn't they put it nearby, which was going to have less of an impact? The absence of local knowledge. Again, there's no easy answers, but it does come up quite frequently that local knowledge is being ignored.
Thank you, Susan. We are on the dots, but Daniel, you have one final question, and I just briefly want to touch upon that before we conclude. So please, Dan. Okay, Dan. Oh, okay, yeah. Yes, please. Daniel, we can't hear you for some reason.
We can hear you now, I think.
Can you speak? And we can try.
Hello?
Yes,
perfect.
Right.
Yes. So I was thinking around the green economy concept, and also the circular economy concept in financing. And if you look at the data around, a lot of banks are now thinking of secular bonds. They are thinking of green investment. So although the EIAs will take place, there are specific economic instruments that ensures that during the entire project cycle and afterwards, there is sustainability that is ensured. So I was wondering whether these MDDs are really giving out, for example, secular bonds and other schemes that ensures that the protection of the environment and social equity is achieved in development. Did you come across any of these instruments, for example? Thank you. And thanks, Gustav.
Thanks, Daniel. I don't know about circular bonds. I know about the green bonds, and Christina Balboa has a great piece in Global Environmental Politics where they question just how green they actually can be. But unfortunately, it's a bit beyond my research. But I'm very curious to see whether or not these circular bonds can be the magic bullet, maybe.
All right. So let's conclude there. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you also kindly to Susan, who has stayed up late, and of course, as many of you are as well, staying up late. I can see Mitzi's outside window. We went from broad daylight to sunset to now being completely dark, and others are just waking up. So it's really nice to see everyone jointly. Of course, we will have sessions on either end. And we have half an hour break, 27. Sorry, we run a little bit over. When